You know, when we look back at history, some stories just grab you by the collar and refuse to let go.
Oh, absolutely.
Empires rise and fall, sure, but few narratives are quite as dramatic, I think, and filled with such profound, internal tension as the story of the Russian Empire.
Mm,
It's a story not just of, vast lands and powerful rulers, but really of these deep-seated contradictions that ultimately led to its spectacular, almost explosive collapse.
yeah, really imploded.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the heart of the Russian Empire. We're going to trace its journey right from its formal proclamation back in 1721 by Peter the Great,
Right.
all the way to its cataclysmic implosion in 1917.
A huge span of time.
And our mission really is to unpack the central paradox that defined this colossal state, this relentless, almost desperate drive for great power status and modernization, clashing head-on with an unyielding, almost dogmatic commitment to autocracy and a very rigid social order.
That's the core tension, isn't it?
Exactly. We're going to explore how these state-led reforms, which were initiated really with the sole intent of strengthening the empire,
Right, making it stronger.
paradoxically unleashed forces that its own deeply conservative political system was simply utterly incapable of accommodating. It couldn't handle what it created.
Exactly. And our sources, we've got everything from, incisive executive summaries to really detailed research briefs, economic studies. They paint this vivid picture. An empire caught in an irreconcilable struggle.
A tug of war.
A tug of war, that's a great way to put it, between progress and tradition that it could never truly win. We'll meticulously examine key moments, things like Peter's revolutionary table of ranks,
Okay.
the emancipation of the serfs, which was massive,
It's huge, yeah.
Sergei Witte's ambitious industrialization programs, and of course the immense pressures of war. We need to understand how all these elements collectively form this veritable powder keg of discontent.
Powder keg. I like that.
And what's truly fascinating here is how these seemingly disparate threads connect. They show that the 1917 collapse wasn't just sudden. It wasn't unpredictable.
Right, not out of the blue.
Not at all. It was the violent culmination of these structural weaknesses, all exposed and amplified by the crucible of World War I. So get ready for some genuine aha moments, because this story, it profoundly shapes the world we live in today. Its echoes are still around.
Okay, let's dive in. To really understand this unfolding drama, we have to rewind. Back to 1721 to this towering figure who quite literally dragged Russia into the modern age, Peter the Great.
Pierre.
His ambition wasn't just to rule, was it? It was to utterly reshape the vast, ancient Muscovite state, forge it into something entirely new.
That's right. Reshape is the word.
So let's talk about that formal establishment in 1721, the birth of the empire.
Okay.
This wasn't just a name change, right? Peter had declaring the Russian Empire. It was way more than a fancy new title.
Oh, much more. It was a deliberate, incredibly audacious declaration to the world and, importantly, to his own people. Russia was no longer content being this sort of insular, Eastern-oriented power.
Looking inwards.
Exactly. This was a forceful, almost violent reorientation. The goal: transform the Muscovite state into a modern European military and naval powerhouse.
Military and naval, key focus.
Absolutely key. Peter's gaze was firmly fixed west. Not, it's important to say, for its democratic ideals or liberal philosophy,
so not that.
but for its technological prowess, its military organization, its administrative efficiency. He saw the rising power of nations like Sweden, France, England, and he was absolutely determined that Russia would not only join their ranks, but surpass them.
Wow. Ambition.
Huge ambition.
Yeah.
And this shift was profound. It impacted every facet of the state and society. I mean, from the famously controversial order to cut off the traditional long beards of the boyars,
You're right. I remember hearing about that.
to the construction of a modern navy, practically from scratch. But the most visible, truly monumental symbol of this ambition was the relocation of the capital. Around 1713, moving it from traditional Moscow.
Moscow, the heart of old
A
Russia.
heart, with its ancient Kremlin walls, its onion-domed churches steeped in Byzantine tradition, its conservative boyar elite, moving it to the brand-new, Western-oriented city of St. Petersburg.
Built from nothing, wasn't it? On a swamp.
Literally built from scratch on a swampy estuary of the Neva River. A place with no existing infrastructure, no population to speak of. It was sheer audacity, a deliberate statement, a city literally facing west, designed to be Russia's window on Europe.
A window on Europe?
And again, it wasn't about adopting liberal European ideas. It was about pragmatically importing the tools of power.
What kind of tools?
Military engineering, shipbuilding, state administration techniques, projecting an image of strength and modernity on the international stage. He wanted Russia recognized as a formidable player among Europe's great powers, and he was willing to make radical internal changes, whatever the human cost, to get there.
And that move, geographically, it wasn't just symbolic. It felt provocative, like deliberately turning away from centuries of Muscovite tradition, facing west, signaling this relentless drive for European recognition.
Absolutely. Provocative is a good word.
Peter's vision was grand, clearly. But to achieve this great power status, he knew he needed more than a new capital. He needed a completely reorganized state apparatus. Loyal, efficient.
Couldn't rely on the old ways.
No. Which brings us to one of his most, well, ingenious and frankly revolutionary tools for forging this new state, the Table of Ranks, introduced in 1722.
Yes, the Table of Ranks. Crucial.
This wasn't just some dusty bureaucratic document, was it? It sounds more like a radical social engineering project.
It really was. A system that meticulously classified all military, civil, and even court services into this rigid hierarchy. 14 distinct categories, each with specific requirements, specific privileges.
14 steps on the ladder. And what was the real purpose behind it?
Well, what's truly fascinating is its dual purpose, almost subversive, you could say. On one hand, it was designed to systematically weaken the traditional aristocracy.
The old guard, the boyars.
Exactly. Those entrenched, hereditary noble families whose power was rooted in centuries-old land holdings, local influence, birthright, often operating outside the Tsar's direct control. Their inherited status often meant they felt little obligation to actually serve the state actively.
Right, their power wasn't dependent on the Tsar.
Not directly. So the Table of Ranks aimed to diminish that ancient power by making service, not birth, the primary determinant of status.
So it essentially flipped the social ladder. Your family name no longer guaranteed your position.
Precisely. Your performance, your loyalty to the state mattered most. And on the other hand, its second purpose was to foster this new class of loyal officials and military officers, people whose status and advancement depended entirely on their competence and dedication to the state, not their lineage.
Interesting. So it created a path for non-nobles.
Yes, a path, a ladder, for commoners, individuals from non-noble backgrounds, to achieve high status, even hereditary noble status for themselves and their descendants, purely through their merit and service.
Wow.
Imagine being a peasant son who, through sheer talent and hard work in the military or the civil administration, could rise to a position of power, maybe even found a new noble family. This was genuinely revolutionary in principle for a society as rigid as Russia's.
It sounds like a really powerful institutional tool, designed to cement the Tsar's control, inject new blood into the bureaucracy, ensure loyalty flowed upwards to the autocrat.
That was the design, yes.
However, while it was intended, clearly, to create a more efficient and meritocratic state, our sources also suggest it wasn't quite perfect in practice. It inadvertently became a source of corruption.
That's right. Human nature finds a way, doesn't it? Individuals started maneuvering for higher ranks through means other than pure merit. Connections, bribery, perhaps.
And it also, over time, allowed this new breed of careerists to ascend through state service.
Yes, and this subtly changed the very definition of nobility. It shifted from one based purely on ancient lineage to one more tied to state loyalty and, well, sometimes just self-serving ambition. It potentially diluted that traditional sense of aristocratic duty.
So complex, unforeseen consequences, even from well-intentioned top-down reforms.
Indeed. It's a classic example. Institutional designs, no matter how clever, can have these ripple effects, reshaping society in ways the architects might not have intended.
Okay, so the state's power wasn't just built on bureaucracy and military service, even with the Table of Ranks. It needed something deeper, didn't it? A validation, almost mystical.
Absolutely. It rested on a profound spiritual and ideological foundation. You can't underestimate the role of religion and ideology here.
This is where we get into the spiritual cement of the empire, the bedrock that gave its rulers that almost sacred authority. Imperial rule wasn't just about armies or administrators. It was sustained by this powerful, almost indivisible fusion of political and religious power.
Indivisible is a good word for it.
And this goes back quite a way, right, after the fall of Constantinople in 1453.
Yes, that was a pivotal moment. The Orthodox Church in Muscovy saw itself as the last bastion of true Christianity after the Byzantine Empire collapsed.
Yeah.
They began to claim Muscovy as the Third Rome.
The Third Rome, that's a powerful idea.
Hugely powerful. It elevated Muscovy's rulers who adopted the title Tsar derived directly from the Roman Caesar, giving them this colossal ideological claim: universal Christian leadership, a divine mandate.
So the Tsar wasn't just a king, he was seen as God's chosen ruler on earth.
Essentially, yes. This Third Rome ideology underpinned the core belief that the Russian ruler was the world's only true Christian sovereign, endowed with divine, unlimited authority, an authority directly bestowed by God, making him accountable to no earthly power, only to God.
Wow, unlimited authority.
That was the theory. And this religious justification for autocracy wasn't just some ancient belief left on the shelf. It was later powerfully codified and articulated under Emperor Nicholas I.
Nicholas I, much later, 1825 to 1855.
Right. He formulated the famous doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. And this wasn't just dusting off an old idea. It was a very deliberate reactionary response to the liberal, nationalist, and revolutionary ideas spreading like wildfire from Western Europe after the Napoleonic Wars.
So it was defensive against Western ideas.
Very much so. Nicholas, I saw these foreign influences, liberalism, constitutionalism, nationalism, as existential threats to the Russian order, to autocracy itself.
So orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality wasn't just a motto for a school banner. It was an active, defensive, unifying ideology.
Exactly. It aimed to achieve imperial unity and stability by rallying the populace around these three pillars, while actively suppressing foreign influence and any dissenting thought.
Let's break that down.
Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy represented the spiritual foundation, the moral compass. The Russian Orthodox Church acting as a loyal, subordinate pillar of the state.
Autocracy.
That signified the absolute undivided power of the Tsar, presented as the necessary guarantor of order and stability in a vast, potentially chaotic empire.
And nationality.
Nationality invoked this sense of a unique Russian identity. Narodnost is the Russian word, a cultural and historical distinctiveness to be cherished and often imposed on the empire's diverse populations. We'll come back to that.
Okay, so this triad wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was the ideological cement of the empire, meticulously designed to promote a singular identity, a singular purpose, flowing from the throne right down to the village church.
Precisely. It permeated society.
It sounds like a perfectly unified, unchallengeable system on paper. A fortress of faith and power, however. There's always a however, isn't there?
Always.
Despite these powerful ideological tools, these institutional structures like the table of ranks, the day-to-day reality of governance often fell dramatically short of this absolute ideal.
The theory and the practice often diverged.
The theory of autocratic perfection often seemed to crumble under the weight of practical implementation, which leads us to another paradox.
Yes.
The paradox of power. An inefficient conservative bureaucracy.
Ah, yes. The machinery of state itself.
Despite this theoretical centralization of power, despite Peter the Great's grand designs for a modern, efficient state, the Tsarist bureaucracy was, in practice, well, surprisingly small for such a huge empire.
Relatively speaking, yes, compared to Western European states.
And notoriously slow, often quite inefficient. Our sources highlight Peter's struggles just to pay officials in money rather than letting them live off the land.
Right, that old practice of Kormlani, where officials essentially extorted their salaries from the local population they governed. A recipe for corruption.
And Peter tried to end it, but it stubbornly persisted in many areas. Breeding corruption, local autonomy, undermining central control.
It was deeply entrenched. And it's telling that the state's actual administrative budget remained a tiny fraction of its total spending throughout the imperial period. Most money went elsewhere, military, court, etc.
So the bureaucracy wasn't just small and sometimes corrupt, it was also conservative.
What's truly striking is the internal dynamic. While the table of ranks aimed for meritocracy, the bureaucracy itself, with its entrenched interests, its internal power struggles between different ministries and factions, and its deeply conservative nature, often acted as a brake. It limited the Tsar's actual ability to implement reforms effectively.
So the Tsar issues a decree.
And it gets slowed down, diluted, maybe quietly resisted by the very officials supposed to execute it.
Our sources argue it sometimes reduced the emperor to being merely a promulgator of laws rather than a true absolute ruler in practice. Which raises a big question. If the bureaucracy was so inefficient and resistant, how did the empire even function for centuries? Especially one so vast and ambitious.
It points to this constant struggle between the autocratic ideal and the messy reality of governing. Maybe it functioned despite the bureaucracy in some ways, relying on inertia, local networks, coercion.
And this brings us to a crucial connection, doesn't it? Looking at Peter I's westernizing reforms and Nicholas I's anti-Western doctrine, they seem completely contradictory.
On the surface, yes. Peter looking west for models, Nicholas rejecting Western ideas.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, our sources suggest they were actually two sides of the same coin.
How so?
Both approaches were primarily concerned with one thing: buttressing the autocratic state, ensuring its survival and power.
Ah, okay, so Peter wanted a strong military and bureaucracy for the autocracy.
Right, to make it powerful. While Nicholas wanted to preserve absolute power by rejecting the liberal and modernizing ideas that were, ironically, a natural byproduct of Peter's initial embrace of the West.
Interesting, so the core goal remained the same. Preserve autocracy. The methods differed, but the aim was constant.
Exactly. And this highlights that inherent conflict, that underlying fault line right from the beginning, a relentless drive for external power and modernization, always subservient to and ultimately undermined by the preservation of internal autocratic control.
A fundamental contradiction baked into the system.
Baked right in. Okay, so we've established this foundational tension within the autocracy itself. Now let's shift our gaze down to the base of Russian society, where the deepest contradictions lay simmering, like a social volcano.
Ah, yes. Serfdom.
Serfdom, the empire's massive economic and moral burden.
The central social and economic institution for centuries. You can't understand Russia without understanding serfdom.
And by the mid-19th century, it was widely recognized, even inside the government, even among nobles, as a major, undeniable obstacle to any meaningful modernization.
Absolutely. It wasn't just a legal status. It was this deeply ingrained feudal system that legally tied peasants, the vast majority of the population, to landowners.
Tied them how?
They were essentially rendered the property of their noble masters. They could be bought and sold, traded like commodities, their lives dictated by the land they toiled on, and the whims of their owner.
And it also provided the army, right, through coercion.
Yes, the military system relied heavily on it. Serfs could be arbitrarily drafted into service for decades, often 25 years. Many never returned to their villages. It was a brutal system.
Just imagine that, an entire nation where the vast majority, maybe 80–90% of its people, couldn't freely move.
Couldn't innovate beyond the narrow confines of their village traditions.
Couldn't pursue education or specialized trades easily. Couldn't truly contribute to a modern, dynamic economy.
It fundamentally stifled economic mobility. It created this unique, almost self-defeating economic paralysis.
It wasn't just morally bankrupt in an age that was starting to think more about human rights. It meant Russia, desperate to catch up with industrializing Europe, lacked the very bedrock of a modern economy: a free, mobile workforce.
Precisely. Our sources underscore how this ancient system created a society where true social and economic progress was fundamentally limited. It hindered the growth of a market economy, entrepreneurship, urban development, all of it.
And the devastating cost of this economic and moral anachronism became horrifyingly clear, didn't it, on the battlefield?
The Crimean War.
The Crimean War's harsh wake-up call, 1853 to 1856.
That cost, that brutal reality, manifested itself in Russia's humiliating defeat. And it wasn't just a loss. It was a profound, undeniable, deeply shocking wake-up call for the entire empire, a national trauma.
Our sources call it a titanic test.
A titanic test that the Tsarist system failed in a singular and catastrophic way. The war starkly exposed the military and technological backwardness of a state trying to fight a modern war with an unfree population.
How so?
Russia's reliance on serf conscripts, often poorly equipped, poorly trained, sometimes marching hundreds of miles just to reach the battlefront, against the technologically superior, industrially supplied forces of Britain and France. It was a tragic mismatch.
Logistical failures, too.
Staggering logistical failures. Inadequate roads, hardly any railways then, to transport troops and supplies effectively. Antiquated weaponry. It was a disaster.
And it wasn't just the military side that was exposed.
No. The defeat generated something new and powerful. Public opinion. Among the intelligentsia, the educated classes, and even wider segments of society. People openly began to challenge the traditional values of autocracy, questioning its competence, its models of heroism, its governance, its moral legitimacy even.
So it wasn't just about losing battles, it was about the fundamental inadequacy of the whole system being laid bare.
Exactly. It was a systemic failure.
It's hard to overstate the impact. This wasn't some minor colonial skirmish. This was a major war against Europe's leading powers, fought on Russia's own doorstep, exposing its vulnerability for everyone to see.
A profound humiliation.
And that defeat directly catalyzed Alexander II's great reforms, didn't it? It forced the empire to confront its deepest structural flaws because the alternatives seemed to be continued decline, maybe even disintegration.
It really underscores how acute external pressures often forced internal changes, even if reluctantly, grudgingly, in a system inherently resistant to fundamental transformation.
And the most significant of these forced reforms, the one that truly changed the fabric of Russian society,
The abolition of serfdom.
the Emancipation Reform of 1861, a monumental step, but with a critical flaw.
Always that flaw, isn't there?
So 1861, Emancipation, without doubt, a landmark event, a colossal turning point. Millions of serfs, over 23 million, the numbers are staggering, freed overnight, transformed from chattel into legally free citizens.
Conceptually, it was a monumental step forward, a moral imperative that had been debated for decades.
And it did have positive effects initially.
Oh yes, significant and immediate positive effects on the economy and society. Our sources detail this. Peer-reviewed research shows a substantial jump, 10.3% in agricultural productivity, specifically grain yield, above the pre-existing trend.
That's quite specific, 10.3%.
It's a remarkable jump, indicating a real surge in incentive, labor efficiency, once people were working for themselves, nominally at least.
Any other positive effects?
Measurably improved living standards. There's compelling data showing Army draftees increasing by an average of 1.7 centimeters in height.
Height, how does that work?
It's a clear, direct indicator of better nutrition and improved health for the younger generation growing up after emancipation. More food, better conditions.
Interesting. And industry.
Industrial development got a much-needed boost. Industrial employment increased by 3.6 times in the average province. Why? Because a newly free labor force could finally migrate from the countryside to urban centers, fueling the nascent industrial economy, providing workers for factories.
Okay, so real measurable benefits. But here's where it gets really complex and, frankly, quite tragic.
The implementation.
While the liberation itself was momentous, necessary, the land reform that came with it, as our sources reveal, carried this deeply critical, almost self-sabotaging flaw.
What was the flaw?
The state, trying to maintain social control, trying to protect the landowning nobility's interests, and crucially, trying to prevent a huge, landless, potentially volatile proletariat from forming in the countryside.
Okay, understandable concerns from their perspective.
Understandable, perhaps. But they didn't grant land to individual peasants outright. Instead, they gave the land to these repartition peasant communes, the mir.
Oh, the mir, the village commune.
And this decision, made perhaps with intentions of stability, proved to be a profound error in the long run.
How so? Why was the commune system a problem?
Well, this communal land tenure system, the mir, proved to be an inefficient institution. Our sources are quite clear on this. It significantly slowed down agricultural growth and severely hindered peasant mobility.
So it actually held back progress.
Yes. This finding supports the arguments of the famous economic historian Alexander Gerschenkron. He argued that while freeing the serfs was essential for modernization, the way it was done ultimately stifled its potential.
Why was the commune inefficient?
The mir often involved periodically repartitioning the land among peasant households based on family size. Imagine you're a farmer, you work incredibly hard to improve your plot, maybe drain some marshy bits, fertilize it, invest your sweat and meager resources,
Right.
only to have that improved plot potentially reallocated and redistributed next season or in a few years to another family whose size changed.
Ah, so no incentive for long-term investment.
Precisely. Our sources detail how this significantly disincentivized long-term investment in land. It prevented improvements in farming techniques, crop rotation, things like that,
Wow.
ultimately slowing agricultural growth. And crucially, it tethered peasants to their villages.
Wow.
Through collective responsibility for taxes and redemption payments and the communal control over land and movement, it hindered the very mobility needed for broader industrialization and economic dynamism. People couldn't just pick up and leave easily. And you mentioned redemption payments.
Yes. Peasants were saddled with these redemption payments for the land they received, land they often felt was rightfully theirs anyway. It was a massive debt they'd struggle with for decades, until 1907 officially. Effectively, it replaced one form of bondage, serfdom, with another, debt bondage to the state and the commune.
So what does this all mean for the empire's grand narrative, the big picture?
It means this is a classic example of a state-led modernization effort that was progressive in principle, freeing the serfs, was huge, but fatally flawed in implementation.
Because they tried to control it too much.
Exactly. The failure to address the deep-seated land hunger of the peasantry, their desperate, yearning need for more productive land of their own, held individually transformed what should have been a solution into a deepening agrarian crisis, essentially creating a ticking time bomb in the countryside.
A ticking time bomb. There it is again.
It demonstrated the regime's structural inability to fully commit to liberal, market-based reforms. It ultimately fueled the very discontent it was meant to appease. So, yes, a huge positive step, emancipation, but it created a whole new set of long-term structural problems.
Showing that inherent conflict again, the state trying to modernize while desperately clinging to control, ultimately undermining its own goals and creating new sources of instability.
The paradox in action.
Okay, so that agrarian crisis, those ticking time bombs in the countryside, they weren't the only pressures building. The humiliating lessons from Crimea weren't forgotten. The empire knew it had to modernize in another critical area, industry.
Yes, it was an imperative. A matter of survival, not just prestige anymore.
The need for industrialization was sharply, unmistakably recognized after Crimea.
Absolutely. The empire's leaders understood, with painful clarity, that military strength, great power status in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, it was inextricably linked to industrial capacity.
What does that mean, industrial capacity?
The ability to produce steel for railways, for warships, modern weaponry, advanced machinery, all the vast infrastructure of a modern military-industrial complex. Russia simply couldn't afford to fall behind again. Its geopolitical position depended on it.
That humiliation of 1856 really stuck.
It instilled a profound sense of urgency, drove home the point. A predominantly agrarian, unindustrialized nation could not compete with the advanced industrial powers of Western Europe.
This recognition wasn't just a casual thought, it was a driving force. It led to this dramatic, concerted period of economic transformation, the Great Spurt.
The Great Spurt, a deliberate state-engineered effort to leapfrog decades of industrial development, compressing what took generations in the West into just a matter of years.
And who is behind this?
This Great Spurt was a period of incredibly rapid state-led industrial growth, largely orchestrated by the brilliant, often ruthless, and exceptionally ambitious Minister of Finance, Sergei Witte.
Witte, a key figure.
Absolutely. A true visionary, in his way. Convinced Russia's future as a great power depended entirely on rapid industrialization. His strategy was audacious. He believed the sole means to industrialize quickly, provide the country with affordable goods, build a strong military, was to jumpstart the economy.
How do you jumpstart an economy like that?
Through massive foreign loans, primarily from France, actually, and heavy state intervention in the economy.
Foreign loans and state control.
That was Witte's formula. He implemented a series of key strategic reforms, boldly put the Russian ruble on the gold standard in 1897.
Why was that important?
A crucial move. It stabilized the currency, made it convertible, and crucially attracted much-needed foreign capital by reducing the risk for international investors. Made Russia seem like a safer bet.
What else?
He significantly increased tariffs to protect Russia's nascent domestic industries from foreign competition, allowing them breathing room to grow. And, crucially for revenue, he established a state monopoly on spirits, vodka, essentially.
The vodka monopoly.
It generated enormous government revenue, a vital, consistent stream of funds for his ambitious large-scale infrastructure projects.
And where did a lot of this money go? The loans, the vodka money?
A significant portion went directly to Russia's burgeoning railway system. Railways were seen as absolutely critical for military mobility, resource extraction, and unifying the vast empire. By 1900, our sources note, at least half of the country's colossal 6 billion ruble public debt had been raised for railways alone.
Half the debt was railways.
Yeah.
And the crowning achievement of this expansion.
The engineering marvel that truly captured the world's imagination, the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway.
The Trans-Siberian, iconic.
A truly massive state-funded project spanning thousands of miles. It wasn't just a transport link, it was a geopolitical statement. Opening up remote regions of Siberia for settlement, resource extraction timber, minerals facilitating trade, projecting power eastward.
So Witte's state-led model, it worked, at least in terms of growth.
It resulted in truly impressive economic growth rates. The economy grew at approximately 3% per annum in per capita terms, which is very strong for the period. Remarkable expansion in heavy industries, oil, coal, steel. In its immediate economic and strategic goals building industrial muscle, it was a clear success.
It transformed Russia into a major industrial player by the turn of the century.
Laid the foundations for a modern industrial economy, boosted military potential. Sounds great, but
But this rapid growth, while economically successful on paper, came at a profound social cost. And it created this dangerous, volatile imbalance that would ultimately prove deeply destabilizing.
okay, this is a crucial point. It speaks directly to our central paradox. Russia's industrialization was, you called it asymmetric, different from the West.
Yes, asymmetric. Unlike the more liberal, market-based industrialization in Western Europe, which often developed more organically alongside the growth of civil society, stronger private property rights, and expanding, stabilizing middle class.
Right, the bourgeoisie.
Russia's model was imposed almost entirely from above, top-down. It was designed, first and foremost, to serve the power of the state, to create military might, national prestige, not primarily to foster a broad-based economic or social transformation for the benefit of the general populace.
So the state was the main driver.
Exactly. The state acted as a primary driver of capital, borrowing heavily from abroad. It was also a major consumer of the industrial products, especially for its military and those massive railway projects.
And this didn't create a strong middle class.
No. This top-down, state-centric approach did not organically foster a powerful and stabilizing middle class, the kind that often provides a buffer against revolutionary fervor in other nations, because they have a vested interest in order, stability, gradual reform.
So what did it create instead?
Instead, this rapid, state-driven urbanization, fueled by those former peasants migrating from the communes to the cities seeking work, it created a militant, urban working class, highly concentrated in large factories in places like St. Petersburg and Moscow.
Militant. Why militant?
Because these workers lived under incredibly harsh conditions. Crammed into unsanitary barracks, working incredibly long hours for very low pay, with virtually no safety net, no labor protections to speak of. Accidents were common. Life was brutal.
And crucially,
They lacked any meaningful political rights, no legal unions, no right to strike effectively, no real avenues for expressing their grievances peacefully. This made them incredibly fertile ground for radical ideas and revolutionary movements, promising a complete overthrow of the system.
so you have this powerful economic engine churning out steel, oil, railways, but it's simultaneously churning out social discontent at an equally rapid, dangerous pace.
Exactly. A byproduct of its own success, in a way.
This is a crucial connection to the bigger picture, then. The economic solution, industrialization, meant to strengthen the autocratic state, paradoxically exacerbated the social and political problem of autocracy.
How so?
By creating this volatile, concentrated working class and not providing avenues for political expression, social mobility, or economic justice, the state effectively created the very social forces that would demand an end to the autocratic system itself.
It's that inherent conflict again, that fundamental dilemma, playing out in a dramatic, increasingly dangerous new way, adding another volatile layer to the societal dynamite that was accumulating.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the internal tensions of the autocracy itself, the social fault lines from emancipation and industrialization, but let's not forget the sheer scale of this empire.
Its vastness.
This was a sprawling, multi-ethnic behemoth, and its vast territorial reach created its own unique set of challenges and contradictions, shaping its destiny just as profoundly as its internal policies.
Absolutely. You can't separate the internal dynamics from the imperial project itself.
Let's talk about this land-based giant, the contiguous nature of Russian expansion.
Russia's territorial expansion was an absolutely defining feature, a constant process for centuries. Driven by this complex mix of strategic motives, economic desires, even civilizational or religious justifications.
Like Peter the Great pushing to the Baltic.
Exactly. Peter's relentless push to the Baltic Sea was a deliberate effort to secure that window on Europe, get warm water ports, establish Russia as a great naval power capable of competing with the maritime nations of the West.
And later expansion, south and east.
Later expansion into the Caucasus, into Central Asia, into the Far East, driven by a need for vital resources like oil discovered in Baku in the Caucasus.
Strategic reasons, too.
Definitely. Strategic buffering against powerful rivals, especially the British Empire, during the intense Great Game for influence across Asia. And sometimes this mission civilisatrix idea, or protecting Orthodox Christians in Ottoman territories, projecting Russia's role as a Slavic and Orthodox protector.
What's truly fascinating here, and a key distinction from other empires like Britain or France,
They're overseas empires, yeah.
was Russia's geographical nature. Their empires were mostly overseas, separated by vast oceans. This allowed for a degree of detachment, maybe, between the metropole and the colony.
A clear separation.
Russia's expansion, in stark contrast, was largely contiguous, land-based, spreading out from its Muscovite core across the Eurasian landmass.
Which meant?
Which meant the Russian state had to constantly grapple with this fundamental, inescapable question. How do you integrate or rule these newly conquered populations when they are literally right next door, sharing borders, often intermingling?
That contiguous nature created a unique and persistent dilemma. Unlike the British in India, for example, who could maintain a clearer physical and ideological separation.
Right, that's in them.
Russia's rulers, Russian settlers, and the conquered peoples often lived side by side, in direct, daily contact.
And this forced proximity meant?
It meant that wars of conquest were often not perceived as purely foreign wars in the same way. They frequently became long, drawn-out internal conflicts, blurring the lines between external expansion and internal security.
Like the Caucasus.
Exactly. Think of the Caucasus, where Russia faced decades of violent resistance. What many historians now call decolonization wars, long before the term was common. Most famously, the nearly 50-year struggle against Imam Shamil's militant Islamic movement in the mid-19th century.
50 years.
It was brutal, prolonged. Our sources highlight that administering these incredibly diverse peripheries was a constant challenge. Policies would alternate, sometimes attempts at assimilation, sometimes trying to co-opt local elites, sometimes encouraging internal divisions among conquered groups to make them easier to rule, often inadvertently exacerbating local tensions and resentments.
So this constant interaction, this proximity, profoundly shaped Russia's approach to its diverse populations.
Absolutely, leading directly to the enduring challenges of nationality policy within the empire. Russification.
Russification and its discontents. The multi-ethnic challenge.
With over 100 different ethnic groups listed in the census, speaking dozens of languages, practicing myriad religions, Orthodox Christianity, Islam, Catholicism, Judaism, Buddhism, animism, sprawling across this vast territory.
Just governing that diversity must have been a nightmare.
It was a persistent, nagging problem. While the state occasionally granted limited autonomy to certain regions, especially earlier on, like Finland retaining its own parliament and legal system for a long time, or Poland initially.
Yeah.
The dominant policy, particularly from the mid-19th century onwards, under pressure from rising nationalism elsewhere and within Russia itself, was Russification.
What was the goal of Russification?
The goal was quite clear and deeply ideological. Unify the empire's incredibly diverse population under a single Russian identity, culture, and language, thereby solidifying loyalty to the Tsar and the Russian state.
And how did they try to achieve that?
Often through the systematic suppression of local languages, traditions, cultures, using the education system, administration, restricting publications.
Any specific examples?
Our sources mention the official prohibition of Ukrainian titles and publications back in 1784, and then again more intensely in the 1860s and 70s with the Ukaz, a direct attack on a distinct national identity and cultural expression. Similar policies targeted the Polish language in schools after uprisings, restricted Baltic German institutions, limited the use of various Turkic languages in Central Asia.
So it wasn't just about language.
No, it was about political control. Ensuring primary loyalty was to the Russian state and its Orthodox faith above any local or ethnic identity. But rather than unifying, this policy often generated deep resentment and actually fueled nationalist separatist movements among the empire's non-Russian populations. It backfired spectacularly in the long run.
But how did this approach compare to other multi-ethnic empires facing similar pressures? This wasn't a uniquely Russian problem, right? Nationalism was rising everywhere.
No, not unique at all. Virtually every large, contiguous empire, think the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, faced this dilemma in the age of nationalism.
Well, let's do that comparison. The Habsburg Empire. Our sources touch on this.
A great comparison. The Habsburg monarchy faced similar, almost existential challenges with its incredibly diverse population. Germans, Magyars, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Serbs, Romanians, Croats, Slovaks, Italians, all developing their own distinct national consciousness, often seeking greater autonomy or even independence.
So how did the Habsburgs try to deal with it? Their approach differed.
Yes, quite significantly, especially after their defeat by Prussia in 1866. The Habsburgs attempted a more, let's say, federalist or concessionary solution with the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, the Ausgleich.
The Ausgleich, what did that do?
It was a direct response to the rising tide of Hungarian nationalism. It created a dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary,
It granted significant power and autonomy to the Magyar elite in Hungary, essentially making them partners in ruling the empire in an effort to stabilize things by satisfying one of its largest and most powerful national groups.
Did it work? Satisfy the Hungarians?
It largely satisfied the Hungarian elite, yes. But this favoritism often angered other national minorities, like the Serbs, Romanians, Croats, Czechs, Slovaks, who felt suppressed and marginalized by the now dominant German elite in the Austrian part and the Magyar elite in the Hungarian part.
So it created new problems.
It led to pervasive resentment, political instability, and a constant struggle for greater rights and representation elsewhere in the empire. It was a compromise that arguably just kicked the can down the road, creating new fault lines.
Okay, so that was the Habsburg approach. Compromise with one major group, hope for the best. How did the Russian approach contrast?
The Russian Empire, as we discussed, relied far more on outright suppression and that singular state-sanctioned nationalism, Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. They weren't really looking for compromises, federalist solutions, or genuine power-sharing agreements with non-Russian elites in the same way.
They were imposing a unified Russian identity and loyalty from the top down. Any deviation was seen as a threat to autocracy itself.
Exactly. And the implications of these different approaches are telling. The experiences of both empires demonstrate that neither a policy of limited concession, like the Habsburgs, nor one of outright suppression, like Russia, could ultimately resolve the fundamental tension between imperial unity and the escalating demands of nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Neither approach worked perfectly.
Not in the long run. The Habsburgs' attempt to satisfy some national groups merely emboldened others and created new internal rivalries, while Russia's reliance on ideological suppression alienated vast swaths of its non-Russian population, creating fertile ground for the very nationalist separatist movements that would erupt so violently in 1917 and contribute massively to the empire's fragmentation.
So this is another crucial structural weakness building up, another layer of accumulated grievances.
Absolutely.
The Russian Empire's inflexible approach, its inability or unwillingness to create institutions for national or political reconciliation, made it particularly vulnerable to collapse when those big external pressures mounted. It highlights that core paradox again. The state's insistence on absolute control and unity through suppression ultimately sowed the seeds of disunity and collapse, setting the stage for the unraveling.
A tragic irony.
Okay, so we've seen these deep structural tensions simmering. Inflexible autocracy, flawed agrarian system, militant working class, restive multi-ethnic empire. It really feels like Russia was stuck in this tragic, recurring loop in the late 19th century.
A cycle, yes.
Time and again, a devastating war brutally exposes the empire's weaknesses, forcing a reluctant hand to make some reforms. But then, almost predictably, the system flinches, pulls back from genuine change, tightens its grip again.
That's a very good summary of the pattern. War as a reluctant catalyst.
Let's trace that cycle. The latter half of the 19th century was characterized by this distinct, tragic pattern. War-induced crises, expose weaknesses, trigger reluctant reform, followed by conservative reaction.
The Crimean War, 1853-56, was the first agonizing turn in this cycle. That titanic test, the system failed in a singular and catastrophic way. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was like a mirror held up to the empire, showing its logistical failures, technological backwardness, the fundamental flaw of serfdom.
A stark wake-up call. National humiliation. It revealed military and tech backwardness, but also generated that new critical public opinion among the intelligentsia.
Right. People started questioning everything, debating Russia's future in salons, underground circles.
And the state's response? Alexander VI's great reforms, emancipation of the serfs, military modernization efforts, introducing universal military service, improving training.
Significant steps, even radical for the time, but largely reactive, weren't they? Born of necessity and fear, not genuine liberal conviction. The Tsar himself famously said it was better to abolish serfdom from above than wait for it to be abolished from below.
Self-preservation, essentially.
Largely. And this pattern, unfortunately for the empire, tragically repeated itself just a few decades later, showing the autocracy's enduring inability to proactively adapt.
Which brings us to the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905. And Bloody Sunday.
Another turn of the wheel.
Another military defeat, this time humiliatingly by an Asian power, Japan, which many in Europe still condescendingly viewed as backward.
That stung badly.
The war, fought over ambitions in Manchuria and Korea, exposed deep corruption, inefficiency in the Tsarist military and bureaucracy again, devastating naval losses at Tsushima. The humiliation was profound, shook the foundations of imperial prestige.
And the internal crisis wasn't a slow burn this time. It was ignited by a specific, horrifying event.
Bloody Sunday, January 1905.
On that fateful day, thousands of peaceful protesters, workers, led by a priest, Father Gapon, carrying icons, portraits of the Tsar, petitions for reform.
What did they want?
Better working conditions, political rights, an end to the disastrous war. They marched to the Tsar's winter palace in St. Petersburg, seeking to appeal directly to their little father, Nicholas II. Instead of meeting them, imperial troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd, massacring hundreds, men, women, children.
Horrifying.
A moment of profound shock and disillusionment. It shattered the myth of the benevolent Tsar for huge numbers of ordinary Russians. It set off this massive wave of strikes, peasant uprisings, mutinies, revolutionary activity across the entire country. It transformed protest into revolution, the 1905 revolution.
And in response to this widespread, violent unrest, its eruption of popular anger, Tsar Nicholas II was eventually forced,
Reluctantly, under immense pressure,
to issue the October Manifesto.
This whole sequence, defeat, internal explosion, reluctant concession, demonstrates so clearly that the Tsar's state wasn't a proactive agent of change. It was deeply reactive. Only willing to concede significant reform after humiliating defeat and internal revolution pushed it to the absolute brink.
And our sources explicitly call these reforms reluctant and grudging.
Yes, indicating that deep resistance within the system to fundamental change. That system valued its absolute power above all else.
So while the October Manifesto offered some hope, maybe a move towards constitutional monarchy, the autocracy was far from ready to truly cede real power.
Not at all. The contradiction remains stark. The need for reform versus the commitment to absolute rule.
Which leads us to the autocracy's enduring grasp, limiting the Duma.
Exactly, the follow-through, or lack thereof.
The October Manifesto, for all its revolutionary implications, had promised civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, conscience, and established the Duma. Meant to be a legislative assembly, some popular representation, a huge step away from pure autocracy on paper.
People genuinely hoped this was the beginning of a new, more liberal era. Finally.
But the Tsar almost immediately moved to reassert his ultimate control, dashing those hopes through the fundamental laws of 1906.
The fundamental law. The fine print, you could say.
What did they do?
They were a direct, deliberate move to severely limit the Duma's power, stripping it of real legislative authority, and explicitly reaffirming autocracy.
Reaffirming autocracy even after establishing a Duma.
Yes. The fundamental laws stated clearly, the Emperor of all Russia possesses supreme autocratic power. It made it clear the Tsar retained absolute control over foreign policy, military affairs, appointing ministers. The Duma could debate, maybe pass some laws, but the Tsar could dissolve it whenever he liked, veto its initiatives. He dissolved the first two Dumas very quickly when they became too critical.
So it was a talking shop, mostly.
Largely, yes. A carefully engineered concession designed to pacify the masses after 1905, without truly relinquishing the monarch's ultimate authority. It highlights that deep-seated ideological commitment to autocracy we discussed. That belief in absolute, divinely sanctioned rule simply couldn't accommodate genuine power sharing, even when facing revolution.
So you see this recurring, inescapable tension. The desperate need for reform is painfully clear, forced by defeat, by unrest. But the entrenched power structure consistently pulls back from fundamental change, refuses to let go of absolute authority.
Creating this incredibly dangerous pressure cooker. Crises expose flaws, force minor concessions, but leave the core problems unresolved, fueling cynicism, deepening disillusionment.
A tragic pattern of too little, too late, setting the stage for the final act.
Precisely, the unraveling.
From limited reforms to revolutionary fervor, that decade after 1905.
The final years of uneasy calm before the storm.
So after 1905, after the October Manifesto, you might think things would stabilize. A glimmer of hope for a constitutional path. But the reality was a decade of profound contradictions, an uneasy calm that ultimately pushed the empire closer to the brink.
The decade between 1905 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914, it was peculiar, deeply unstable. On one hand, yes, continued impressive economic growth in some sectors, building on Witte's spurt, heavy industry, railways. Agricultural output improved somewhat under Stolpen's reforms, though they were controversial.
But on the other hand,
Intensifying political radicalization across society. The Tsarist regime's attempt to stabilize itself through the limited reform of the Duma, plus targeted repression of revolutionaries, Stolpen's necktie, the hangman's noose, it was ultimately unsuccessful. It didn't create lasting stability or genuine public trust.
why not? The reforms were seen as half measures.
Exactly. Concessions extracted under duress, not a genuine commitment to change. The Duma was more a sounding board than a real legislature.
And this is where that institutional rigidity really failed the empire.
Absolutely. The autocracy failed to adapt to the new realities of a modernizing society. It couldn't bend without breaking. It lacked the flexibility to evolve, alienating potential allies, the liberals, the moderates who might have steered Russia towards a more stable constitutional path.
And this failure created a vacuum.
A dangerous social and political vacuum, fueling widespread discontent, pushing people towards more extreme solutions. The alienation of society, the rise of radicalism.
How did that play out?
By consistently failing to enact genuine reform and representative governance, offering concessions with one hand, snatching them back with the other, the state fueled disillusionment among workers, peasants, and political activists everywhere.
The liberals and moderates lost hope.
They were systematically alienated. By the Tsar's continued conservatism, his reliance on dubious figures like Rasputin later on, the Duma's obvious impotence, they saw their hopes for peaceful evolutionary reform dashed again and again. Many lost faith entirely in the system's ability to reform itself.
And the workers and peasants?
Still facing hardship. That land hunger, largely unaddressed. Working conditions often still brutal. They were increasingly drawn to the more radical revolutionary movements who promised wholesale change.
Like the Bolsheviks?
This period saw the flourishing of multiple revolutionary parties. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which famously split into Bolsheviks, Lenin's more radical faction, and Mensheviks, more moderate Marxists, and the Socialist Revolutionaries, or SRs, who focused on peasant issues and land redistribution, often using terrorism.
And they weren't just talking.
No, they were organizing underground, building networks in factories, in villages, even in the army and navy, disseminating illegal propaganda, actively preparing for a more fundamental revolutionary transformation, believing only a complete overthrow of autocracy could solve Russia's deep problems.
So this cumulative effect created a climate ripe for revolution, a palpable sense of instability.
The unresolved tensions were just building. Those ticking time bombs, agrarian crisis, militant workers, frustrated intelligentsia, alienated nationalities, they weren't diffused. They were getting louder. The pressure inside the cooker steadily mounting.
As Russia approached the greatest conflict in human history up to that point.
World War I, the final straw.
Which brings us to the final collapse. Structural weakness meets catastrophe in 1917.
The breaking point.
And 1917 itself, the year the empire collapsed. It's not just history, it's a central point of debate among historians, isn't it? Structural causes versus contingent events.
Absolutely. The great debate. Was it inevitable or was it avoidable?
Let's unpack that, the contingent view first.
Okay. Some historians, the figures like Richard Pipes, perhaps Orlando Fides to an extent, emphasize the role of specific events and, crucially, poor leadership. They argue for a contingent view.
Meaning it wasn't inevitable.
Meaning the fall wasn't necessarily baked in from the start. It was, they argue, a direct result of the personal failings of Tsar Nicholas II. His perceived weakness, his indecisiveness, his stubborn belief in autocracy despite all the warning signs, his disastrous decision to take personal command of the army.
And his obstinate refusal to concede reforms.
Exactly. Refusing reforms when they might still have saved the monarchy, perhaps creating a constitutional monarchy earlier. In this view, World War I wasn't the underlying cause, but the crucial catalyst, the spark that lit a fire that wasn't preordained.
And specific events matter.
Yes, they point to specific immediate events, like the mutiny of the Petrograd garrison in February 1917, when the troops refused to fire on protesters and joined them instead. That deprived the Tsar of his last loyal forces in the capital, leaving him with no power base, leading directly to his abdication. For this perspective, different leadership, maybe a different response to the war, might have averted the disaster.
Okay, that's the contingent view. What about the structural argument?
Then you have the structural argument, often rooted in Marxist traditions or modernization theory. This perspective posits that the revolution was the result of those deep, irreconcilable internal contradictions we've been talking about. A profound crisis of modernization that made a revolutionary crisis almost unavoidable.
So for them, the regime was doomed.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Pregnant with irreconcilable internal contradictions that it had no capacity to resolve. The unresolved agrarian crisis, that relentless land hunger, the militancy of the rapidly growing but politically disenfranchised urban working class. These were the ticking time bombs that made some form of revolutionary upheaval eventually unavoidable. Maybe not exactly in 1917, but sometime.
And the war, in this view.
The war merely exposed and dramatically amplified these existing profound weaknesses. It acted like a giant stress test that the fragile system was bound to fail. It didn't create the fundamental problems, it just brought them crashing down. The system, they argue, was simply unsustainable.
So which one is it? Inevitable implosion or tragic missteps?
Well, the modern consensus, as our sources indicate, offers a more nuanced answer. More complete, I think. It synthesizes these two powerful perspectives.
Okay. The modern consensus. A powder keg ignited by war.
That's the image. The prevailing consensus views the Russian Empire as this veritable powder keg, a fragile, highly unstable entity laden with those deep-seated structural problems we've outlined.
Remind us of those problems.
An inflexible autocracy, refusing to share power or reform meaningfully. An unresolved agrarian crisis, keeping the majority discontent. A volatile, radicalized urban working class, a restive, multi-ethnic population chafing under Russification. These were the structural components, the explosive mixture inside the powder keg.
And the war.
In this synthesized view, World War I was indeed the spark, the ignition. It made these existing profound problems fatal. It turned what might have been a protracted political crisis, maybe even gradual change eventually, into a full-scale, violent, revolutionary collapse.
So the war pushed an always unstable system past its breaking point.
Exactly. The immense strains of fighting a modern, total, industrial war, mobilizing millions, supplying vast fronts, managing economic dislocation, coping with horrific casualties with an anachronistic political and social system. It simply proved too much. The Tsarist state couldn't bear it. The war amplified every existing weakness: food shortages in cities, rampant inflation, transport breakdown, desertion in the army, leading to a complete collapse of authority and public confidence by early 1917.
And it was into this chaos, this vacuum of power, that the Bolsheviks stepped.
Precisely. The Bolsheviks, rather than being the sole cause of the revolution, were able to seize power because of this collapse. Our sources suggest they essentially pushed against an already open door.
How?
By brilliantly, ruthlessly aligning their ideological goals and slogans demanding peace, land, and bread with the most popular urgent demands of the disillusioned masses: an immediate end to the brutal, grinding war, a final radical resolution to the centuries-old agrarian crisis, giving land to the peasants, and alleviating the starvation in the cities.
So the collapse wasn't just a coup.
No. It was therefore not simply a contingent coup or just the fault of one weak ruler, though leadership mattered. It was the violent culmination of a state that had fundamentally failed to resolve its core contradictions over 2 centuries.
It's that inherent conflict we started with, the paradox playing out to its ultimate violent conclusion.
Exactly. The revolution wasn't just an event. It was the tragic, logical endpoint of Russia's defining unresolved struggle between modernization and autocracy.
Wow. So looking back, what's the legacy of all this?
What's truly fascinating, and maybe disturbing, is how the legacy of the Russian Empire seems deeply intertwined with the Soviet Union that succeeded it, and arguably even persists in the modern Russian state today.
How so? What persists?
That tradition of a strong, centralized, often autocratic state, one where the Orthodox Church, even after the Soviet atheist period, often seems a subordinate partner to state power, where political control, state security, is prized above almost all else. That fundamental tension between the imperative for modernization and maintaining absolute political control, which defined the imperial period, it remains a central, recurring theme and echoing struggle throughout Russian history.
It suggests deep-seated institutional and ideological patterns can endure, even across revolutionary changes in regime.
It seems so. It's a powerful continuity, despite the ruptures.
So what does this all mean for us listening today? What's the takeaway?
The story of the Russian Empire serves as a stark, powerful reminder, I think. A reminder of what can happen when a mighty state pursues modernization and great power status with relentless ambition, but without fundamentally adapting its political institutions, without genuinely addressing deep-seated social and economic inequalities.
It's a tale of an empire constantly pushing for external strength, global influence, while neglecting or actively suppressing internal flexibility, genuine reform, the legitimate grievances of its own people.
A cautionary tale about the perils of rigidity
in the face of dynamic change, about trying to pour new wine into old bottles, perhaps.
This deep dive really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do modern states, even today, balance that imperative for economic and technological advancement with the critical need for political and social flexibility? What happens when one outpaces the other, when the foundation can no longer support the structure being built upon it?
Critical questions for any society.
What stands out to you listening to this from this deep dive into an empire that tried desperately to modernize without truly changing its core, a state that built this magnificent, imposing facade while its foundations were just riddled with cracks? Keep thinking about that, because the echoes of this past, they definitely continue to resonate in our world.